Ja, guten Morgen.
Good morning. Very warm welcome.
Zu unserer Veranstaltung Afghanistan
This is
heute.
our meeting Afghanistan today.
Auch meine
Welcome to the discussion Afghanistan today. A very warm welcome to my colleagues here on the podium, Waslat Hasrat-Nazimi, a journalist, and Wolfgang Bauer, author.
beide haben ein Buch
Both
geschrieben, oder
have written a book.
Wolfgang Bauer
Wolfgang Bauer wrote a book at the end of the road, published by Surkamp, and Mrs. Nazimi has written The Lions of Afghanistan. Publisher is Rowohlt. My name is Dieter Schmidt from Frankfurter Buchmesse Association. And if you have expected Cornelia Zetsche as our moderator today, this is not the case. She cannot make it today on a short-term basis. So if you think the moderation is slightly improvised, well, I agreed to do the moderation at a short-term notice, but I think we'll have a nice event anyway. Waslat Hasrat-Nazimi is a journalist, and she is head of the Afghanistan office of Deutsche Welle. She was born in Afghanistan, emigrated as a child to Germany with her parents. She grew up in Germany and calls both countries, Germany and Afghanistan, her home. She knows Afghanistan from her own experience, from visits, and due to her long-term work as a journalist. Her book, The Lions of Afghanistan, deals with the everyday life of Afghan women who, after 15th of August 2023, when the Taliban took over power, women still have problems with women's rights. That is our topic today. This is the topic of her book. Wolfgang Bauer is a journalist, and he writes about crisis situations around the world. He has visited Afghanistan pretty often over the last couple of years, the last 20 years. This morning, he came back directly from Kabul. He flew in directly from Kabul. He has very recent impressions. We will hear about that later. He is very well known because he wrote a book across the sea when he traveled with Syrian refugees from Africa to Europe. At the end of the road does not only describe a journey about the only road that leads you through Afghanistan, 2,000 kilometers through the country of Afghanistan. At the end of the road is a synonym for the failed politics of the Western world in Afghanistan. Waslat, 15th of August 2021, was a difficult day, a turning point in Afghanistan and the life of women. Your book writes about a longer period of time. We do not only talk about the day when the Taliban took over power, but about the role of society, the role of women in society in Afghanistan, their position. And of course, on the 15th of August, there was a turning point. Can you tell us more about the book? Why have you written? Why did you write the book? What is your own relation to the people we learn about in the book, The Lionesses of Afghanistan? Why did I write the book? It is the reason why I am interested in Afghanistan, while I work with and about Afghanistan. Since living in Germany, people talk to me and say, tell me about your home country, Afghanistan. Since then, I am a representative of Afghanistan. This is how I feel. I fought this position. For a long time, I didn't feel like doing that. But one day, I thought, okay, If people always think I'm an expert, I'm a representative for Afghanistan, let's learn more about it. Although it also is part of my heritage, my mother is also a journalist. And I must say, first of all, I didn't like this idea. The more I learned about Afghanistan, after 18 years, I visited Afghanistan, came back to the country, and I think the country is absolutely intriguing. You visit Afghanistan once, and you will always want to come back. It's so intriguing. I wanted to write the book because I understood that people just make errors. Journalists made errors when writing about Afghanistan. And it was important for me that my point of view is published, that I tell the outside world what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, because my impression is, again, we need this voice to be heard. In your book, you write about women, and you call them the lionesses of Afghanistan, their long fight for self-determination, women who are currently living in Afghanistan and who would like to have self-determination, which is pretty difficult. It's a society that we understand as a very hierarchical, patriarchal society. That is pretty difficult. And this interior view from the women's perspective, is that maybe different? Do you think that women who are living in Afghanistan have maybe more possibilities for self-determination to go beyond the borders than we think from the outside world? Yes, I think so too. Also here in Germany, we have this patriarchal society, not only in Afghanistan or in the countries that we call non-civilized societies. And indeed, I say it is an ultra-patriarchal society in Afghanistan. And of course, women have to find other ways in order to be more self-determined, more emancipated, and they find ways of doing so in a creative way we maybe wouldn't have thought about first, or maybe we in the Western world wouldn't think about. But there are creative ways of working around, and there are always women who are resisting, who are doing demonstrations in the street, women who use Islam and try to fight for their rights. Because what Taliban are doing in Afghanistan, their ideology sometimes is difficult to understand. So they have a lot in common with these ideas. There's another point of view, and that was also the error we did in the last 20 years. So what we tried to do is, and I keep criticizing it in my book, we said women's rights seem to be connected to a military presence which doesn't work together as such per se. And we also say we see women's rights from a Western point of view. And we just try to make them think and live the way we do. It was so fragile that after a couple of days, after a couple of weeks, we lost everything after the Taliban took over power. And that's something I'd like to discuss later, because both of you know the Western world from different points of view. I'm interested in the following thing. The women, can you tell us real stories, examples? You say they try to have this certain type of self-determination, they fight for it, they want to achieve it. But for people who do not know the Afghan society, who only see what we talk about in the media and in books, it's difficult to imagine what they are doing, autonomy in everyday life. What are the flexibilities and leeways? There are many examples. Just let me talk about some examples. As one example, if you would like to be more self-determined as a woman in Afghanistan, you have to behave almost like a man. In Afghanistan, it's a big compliment if you tell a woman, you are like a man, or you are a man, or in my book I say, My father always said, well, my wife is more a man than other men. So that's a big compliment if someone says you're more of a man than any man. So masculinity is something that is a matrix, a yardstick, and the more masculine you are, the better. And that's also true for men. The more masculine, the more self-determination and the more power you have. It's a trap, I think, basically. You call it the dividend of patriarchal society. I describe it in my book, of course, and we have seen that in this country too. And in Afghanistan, it is very extreme. And that's why we have this phenomenon, batapush, that means a woman or a girl who dresses like a boy. A family who has no boy or male person in the family who protects the women. Under the Taliban, a woman is not allowed to leave the house without a man protecting her or being at her side. There are many widows in Afghanistan because of the last 20 years, lots of civil victims. So some take harsh measures, and one of the daughters is dressed as a boy to protect the family, to play this male role. And many say, yes, later on I want to live as if I were a man or a boy. And I'm telling one example of one of these women. She is more than 50 years old, between 50 and 60, and she dresses like a man. People treat her like a man, and it helps her a lot. She has more liberty. She can walk around, she can work, she can move in the street. No one tells her what to do because she dresses as a man. There are many restrictions. It is not allowed to marry. She is not allowed to get married, neither to a man or to a woman, and she is not allowed to have children. That's the price she pays. That's one example. Another example is Islam. We have activists like Tafsilis Tapusha write about her, also Toda Frotan. It is a young girl, and she really says Quran, and her knowledge from the Quran and Islam theology is her line of argument. She says Islam and Quran says, read. That is the first sentence. Read. So both men and women should be educated and should read. And she says, she lives in Herat, that's in western Afghanistan, and she gave a speech. And she had a large audience in her city. It was mainly men, mainly Talibs. And she said exactly what I told. Why did you close the schools if education is one of the central pillars of Islam? A short time later, schools reopened. It was only temporary, and the girl had to leave the country. But we see little steps. We see individual people, we see individual women who found a way to reach more self-determination and to resist. Does this only happen in the cities? Or how is the relation between city and rural areas? Here again, I think in the Western world, in cities, many things are possible, much more than in the rural area or in a village. Society in a village has more difficult structures, it's tougher, it is more traditional. Is that true for Afghanistan as well, or doesn't it matter at all? It was a problem in the last 20 years. So we had this difference between the city and the village. It's been a problem in Afghanistan since Afghanistan has been a national state. So the majority, the absolute majority, lives in villages in the rural area. And that is why many of them were cut off, especially in the southern part and southeast of Afghanistan, from progress that took place in the capital or in other big cities. And right now, we see that the Taliban, for the first time, have a counter-movement. They try to change rural and village mentality, to bring it into the cities. Very interesting. Maybe Wolfgang can tell us more. Right, now I kindly ask Wolfgang, because Wolfgang traveled and he tells us about the ring road. More than 2,000 kilometers. So traveling from the city to the villages. You did that when you visited Afghanistan before, but that's your recent book, At the End of the Road. And it would be very nice to hear more about your journey, about the ring road, and how you started thinking about doing this book and this journey. Yes, in order to continue what you said, yeah. So the microphone is on. Okay, so microphone is on, as we see. So conflict between city and villages in Afghanistan, I can only confirm. One of the big wars in Afghanistan, of many wars in Afghanistan on different levels. And one of the most important wars is the war between the city and the village. This happened when Afghanistan was a kingdom, and as you just said, it was never a classical national state. Afghanistan used to be a mix of different nations, and like the Hazaras perceive themselves as one nation, and they try to become a state, sometimes more, sometimes less. And due to the geography, again, the villages in Afghanistan are extremely radically isolated, very isolated. Most of the villages still do not have paved roads, are not yet connected to cities by paved roads. It's really a donkey path, a footpath, pedestrian path. In most villages, no schools apart from Quran schools. And every village has its own tradition. And this tradition is now disturbed because the central state in the capital, Kabul, and they have tried for a number of years to unify this country, to make it a central state, just like a modern central national state where everybody is governed and administered from the capital. The communists started to do this in a more radical way, which has failed. Then the Mujahideen movement, it also came from the villages, and at that time, so the villages came into the city with very bad consequences for the cities. You might remember the images of Kabul in the 1919, a city in ruins at the beginning of the year 2000 and beyond. I visited the city, almost no paved road, hardly any electricity, very few vehicles, an old part of the city that looked like a village in many ways. And the Americans and the Western world tried to work with people trained in the Soviet Union, in Russia, Afghan experts and technocrats trained in the former Soviet Union or Russia, and to connect with this experiment, to say the countryside should be connected to the cities and create a law that is valid for all villages. And here again, it didn't work. And again, as you said, we have people who live in the village, the Taliban, and they live in the cities, and they walk around through Kabul, they visit the zoo, and they look at five-story buildings, and are really wondering what this is all about and would like to create a new state. Your question, why did I think about writing this book? Well, in the last years, I must say, lots of things went wrong, so I was really angry. Very little understanding in our society for this country. Also, those who do the collaboration and development cooperation, development aid, a lot of money was spent in this country. Some good things have been achieved, but also a lot of problems were created with this money. The ring road is a symbol. And I was angry, and that's why I started writing the book. It was a personal thing. A couple of days before the regime fell, Amrullah Hamda, one of my close colleagues, was shot to death 5th of August with 20 bullets in front of his house in Jalalabad. The night before we talked, and he asked me, what can I do? I feel depressed. And his widow is now living in Germany with her children. His brother lives with me in the city of Reutlingen in the federal state of Baden-Württemberg, where I am at home. So it is a very personal reason why I started writing this book.
Lass uns nochmal auf die Ring Road
Let us
zurückkommen.
talk again
Du
about
hast es
the
als
Ring
Beispiel
Road.
genannt
You said
für
it's an example.
misslungene Entwicklungshilfe,
It's
würde
an
ich es mal
example for
bezeichnen.
development
Es ist
aid
ja
turned bad
eine
or not
Straße,
successful.
die du sehr
The
genau
Ring Road
beschreibst,
is a
die
road that you
über viele,
describe
viele
very
Jahre
well.
gebaut wurde
It has been built
von
over
ganz
many years
unterschiedlichen
by different
Regierungen,
types of
bis
governments.
sie jetzt, ich glaube, inzwischen durchgängig befahrbar
And
ist.
now you can
in
drive
Nordic.
on the Ring Road everywhere. You can drive along the
Das
Ring Road by
denke ich
now.
als Beispiel für
And I think it is an
eine
example
systematische
for a very systematic
Weiterentwicklung in
further development in
Anführungszeichen, die einfach
inverted
nicht
commas.
funktioniert, jedenfalls
Something that
zumindest
doesn't
nicht
work
in
out.
vielen
It
Bereichen,
doesn't
außer dass man da
function,
jetzt drauf rumfahren kann.
not in many ways. Now you can
Das
drive on
würde,
the Ring
denke ich,
Road,
ist
but that's all
eine
there
sehr
is.
spannende
I
Frage,
think
da
it's a
noch mal
very
zu
exciting
gucken und das
question
anhand
to see what happens
diesem Beispiel einfach
and
noch mal
use
zu
this
klären.
example and clarify what happened. There is just one road that connects Afghanistan internally as a ring road. And there is this circular design through from Kabul to Kandahar, Herat to the most important areas, Masai Sharif, and then again through the mountains back to Kabul. So that is the road. And all kings tried to work with idea. They wanted to unify the country with this road, and they wanted to make it accessible for a modern economy and for a modern administration. The kings have built, the Russians have built, Americans built, first under President Bush, and then his predecessors. They all tried to build this ring road, and everybody thought whenever the road leaves to an area, the Taliban won't reign anymore. This road brings prosperity, it'll bring education, and there is this famous quotation where the road stops, Taliban territory starts. That's a famous quotation. But what really happened is the road became this double-edged sword. Many schools were built along the ring road. The markets were easier to access. It didn't help people who lived there a lot, because the villages along the road lost their land. So land speculation, real estate speculation, if you wanted to buy a piece of land, it was extremely expensive. The best thing to do, if you have money in Afghanistan and want to invest, was buying land near the ring road. And people just took the land. So 80% in an illegal way and manner. So people just grabbed the land illegally. Who had the money? The warlords or strongmen, men who have weapons, who have capital. The judges who had the money to bribe judges. So there is no real land registry in Afghanistan. You just went to the land registry, you paid a bribe, and then you said, this is my piece of land, I am the owner. And oftentimes you talked about a piece of land that is owned by a family. And if they wanted to complain, someone else paid a bribe to the judge, and suddenly it belonged to somebody else, even if it had been yours for centuries. If you fought this illegal appropriation of the land, you called the police, the state, the police, the military, just shot those people. And at the end of the day, there was just one possibility: just resist and fight for their rights. And then they joined the Taliban. That is one of the reasons. This is how it happened. This is one example for an idea. So one idea turns into something totally else, turns into the contrary and the opposite. The ring road was not closed, so we drove around the ring road. And at the end of the road, so there are a couple of senses to this title. At the end of the road, there was a ravine. There was 400-meter high, the cliffs 400 meters high. There were people living in that region waiting for passers-by to rob them, maybe 2 flying coaches, 2 buses who drove around, and they just look like bullets because they have experienced a lot. And they drive through the country. Although billions, hundreds of people who wanted to build this road. The attempt was not successful. I traveled and drove on parts of the ring road. It is already falling apart again. So this experiment, in 5 to 10 years, you will just see some meters of paved road. So for the entire infrastructure of Afghanistan that we financed in the last 20 years, it will look like the Pompeii of development aid in the entire land, because the Taliban don't have the means to finance and maintain it. So for the first time, I am hearing this argument. It's the type of criticism you hardly hear in Germany. Not too often, I think. Very impressive. So my question is now to Waslat, Hasrat-Nazimi. My question is, so how about you? In the area you are describing, do you see similar structures, similar errors when people work in this field? Yes, I think one thing we heard on a political level, on a military level in Afghanistan, what was tried. And on the other hand, as Wolfgang said, development cooperation, development aid, I call it the NGO culture in Afghanistan. So NGOs who were competing against each other, projects who sometimes didn't make sense at all. So they simply wanted to see how it continues, to get new projects, to get new money. So we had the Afghan side and we had the development aid. So a lot of corruption, and it was tolerated. So especially women from Afghanistan, Afghan women were supported, who did something about it, who helped, who said, well, one day they have started to speak in a certain way. If you listened to activists or politicians from Afghanistan, all these ladies also spoke the same sentences, and they said, this is what I have to say. And after the interview, they said, you know what they want to hear, right? So among themselves, they knew exactly that this is nonsense and showtime, and that there is nothing, no substance. A lot of Afghan politicians, women who are MPs in the parliament, who are a minister, were corrupt. So that was the only way to do it. If you were a woman in Afghanistan in this system, that was the only way to succeed, was to play the game according to the rules of the game. So in this system with bribes, in this corrupt bribe system, either you played the game, either you had people, warlords, who protected you, or other figures who are doing a lot, who have a lot of power. And so what happened? Women's rights was a topic that was never really addressed. Ivanor, that's a law text, it's against violence against women. The activists were so proud, but Hamid Karzai, former president, really had to write a decree and say there was so much pressure in the parliament, also from women, who said they don't want it because they knew they would no longer have support from the warlords. Some women who are working in the drug trade, we see them. If there is a big difference, they speak with the UN. Everybody knows, but no one dares to speak out. It was always showtime. I think it is frustrating. And also at the same time, something I am reproaching to myself. I should have done something. I should have discussed it more often. I should have said something more often. And I'm just wondering, have I sustained the system by not speaking out against it, by not resisting against it? So we should really try to do something and help the Afghan women. So there is this NGO culture and women's rights. So the ladies who fought for women's rights were the first who had to leave the country. So that means, if I try to pinpoint it, and that's a question for both of you, all the money that was spent from the Western world In Afghanistan, all this money again led to a separation within society, to a type of segregation. We're talking about people who profit from the money because they understood the mechanisms and knew how to get the money. I've seen that in other continents, in other countries. NGOs have enormous funding. They bring a lot of money into a country. And at the end of the day, very few people profit from it. And everything else, people who cannot profit from this money are just left behind. No one sees them. It's like they're invisible. Is that the way you perceive it, or would you say it's different? I don't know whether the funds helped to separate the two sexes. No, it's not only about men and women. It also is about the big question, as you said, you talked about the ring road. Is it similar in other areas? So that money was spent and suddenly there was land speculation. So the money that was sent to Afghanistan was not spent wisely. They had the opposite effect. They separated society. They didn't help society to make headway at all. So the money helped a little bit in the community of the Hazars in Afghanistan. You always have to look at the details. The Shiite group, totally different culture. The last 2 and 3 weeks I traveled with Hazaras, a lot of women among them. And the Hazaras profited a lot. It is the group in Afghanistan who profited the most, I think, from the efforts to bring education in the country, to bring schools. And they despair. The young girls and women are so desperate. Also the young girls and women, their fathers, their brothers are so sorry because most schools for girls are now closed. Whereas the Pashtun in the south, Kandahar, Nangarhar, Pashtun people that I met say indeed, my impression is, I don't know what you think. So women didn't go to school because this strive for education didn't reach the women. So they are also the drivers for Taliban because the woman tells her daughter and then it's being passed on. So that's what I see as a man. I'm at the periphery because mostly I talk to refugee families in Germany when I talk to women. That's how I was able to talk to women. So the Kandahari women are more conservative than the men. So if the daughter wants to do something different, that's a big catastrophe for the mother. I would like to answer. It's because of this dividend of the patriarchal society. Everybody lives in the system, everybody contributes. And a woman has to protect her honor, of course. And that's the honor of her daughters too. And that's how a woman can succeed and have respect in society. Being respected in society is like a vicious circle. You have to protect your honor. And that's true for Afghanistan and for many other areas too. So that's really toxic. The structures we had before, the old connections, the groups, the bribery, the corruption, as you said. And the money that was given led to this enormous build-up. There have been bribery and corruption before, but this money kind of funded it inadvertently. So in the past, people just helped on a friendship basis, so just to bring it, to discuss it in a friendly term. But the last 20 years perverted the system in a way because now it's a violent monster. This is what has come about. There weren't enough controls. There was no possibility to simply get a lot of money in your pockets. A lot of this money can be seen in Dubai, in these new buildings where you see the villas. Palm Beach, Palm Tree, Tashkent, Central Asia. You see the villas. You see it in Kuwait. You see it in Doha, and maybe also in Switzerland. That's where you see the money. So a lot of money was brought abroad, and only a fraction really stayed with people in Afghanistan who are in need. In many cases, it would have been better to give no money. something that is bad, really bad and sad for me. People knew. That's so sad. It is wrong to say we didn't know. One knew how corrupt the Afghan society is. One knew how corrupt Afghan side is. People didn't look at their own corruption, but whenever there were conferences, donor conferences, people said, well, we give you money, but Afghan government should do more against corruption. They should fight corruption. And it was just repeated. It was only lip service, no sanctions, no controls, just mere words that were repeated, no consequences if people didn't do anything. What happens now is, what we hear right now is, Afghan society wanted the Taliban back, now we leave it like that. It is so sad, I think, extremely sad, to see that there is no readiness to see and ask themselves, what did we do wrong? How could we have done it better? And how can we guarantee that these errors of the past will not be repeated? I know we cannot compare Afghanistan and Ukraine, but what we can do is look at parallels. And I think Afghan population deserves better. And also the German taxpayer would deserve better, so that we know what happened with the money we spent and paid. Germany, that's another aspect I'd like to discuss with you. How about the reactions? If people talk to you, you mentioned all these aspects, these arguments. So corruption was mentioned, errors that were made. Is it ignorance from the politician's side? Because what I think is, it is a political question. So people try to do something good and spend money, but they didn't look close enough. One should have looked closer. Well, it sounded a big sum, a couple of millions, billions, and you'd give the money to the NGOs and other organizations and tell them to distribute the funds. Is there currently a political discussion in Germany where we discuss these questions? Or is it now difficult because people only talk about the pandemic and the Ukraine crisis, so people just forgot about it and Afghanistan is left to their own devices? Well, interest went back. We see very few people are joining us here, so very few people are interested in Afghanistan. So thank you to our dear audience for joining us today and being interested in Afghanistan. Thank you. So we have the Enquete Commission, we have the committee who would like to discuss it and do some research into what has happened. But I don't know how this can function because of the structure and the fact that it is always the same people who have dealt with Afghan politics around in these commissions. So I think they won't discover their own errors. Difficult. So I think it's a little bit of hypocrisy. Yes, the Enquete Commission of the German government, I'm not waiting too much. As you said, it's the people who spent the money, so they're not going to unearth their own errors. It's people who were responsible at the time. There are very few Afghanistan experts in these groups. No person who is from Afghanistan or was born there. So the composition of this group, politically speaking, for me at least, is again a failure of our system, because I think I can't see how this will be successful. I hope there will be a turnaround. I kindly ask the politicians to just think more about spending a lot of money in other countries when I talk about development, cooperation and collaboration. Just stop, take a deep breath and say, what were the errors? What did we do wrong? We have to change our whole perception of development aid, development cooperation. There are some holy cows like the Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit in this country, and they administer and organize funds that were for Afghanistan 120 million and 420 million euros every year. So there are different statements about the quantity of the money spent. So I think these agencies have maybe to be dissolved. We need to split them up into smaller agencies focused on individual crisis regions, that would be more reasonable. One has to stop to send development aid experts in the countries who do not speak the language of this country. Very few people I met on site in Afghanistan who actually spoke the language. The GIZ always said it's enough to know the organization, it's more important to know our organization. So you send a person from Afghanistan to Peru, Bolivia, Cameroon, and Colombia. So development aid is not a mass product. You have to learn about the country. It's not an industry. It's not industrial help. And if you try to do it the way we did, you see the results as we see in Afghanistan, the ruins of development aid, development cooperation. We have to create academies. So people who would like to stay longer in these countries, not only for 6 months, or for a year as it was now, but maybe 5 years, 10 years. They should stay in Afghanistan. We need an Afghanistan academy where people learn the language, where people learn more about the countries, where people are well prepared for their time to work in Sahel zone, to work in Afghanistan, so that people understand what they're doing and have an idea of what they're doing. I currently see very few approaches. Maybe small steps will change, some small details will change, but I think this will continue, and this is also true, I think, for Ukraine. You cannot really compare it. But the way, especially the way we administer funds, so there is not enough control. Everything happens like very quickly without a lot of control. You can compare it a little bit to the situation we had in Afghanistan. So we have to know how we can help, but we still have to continue to help, because Afghanistan is not something like a bag of rice that we leave to its own devices. We can't do that. We cannot escape Afghanistan. Afghanistan is our shadow. Afghanistan is our neighbor. Our two countries, our two regions, Europe and Afghanistan, are dovetailed, and there are so many interconnections. It is in our best interest to say that Afghanistan should not be forgotten in world history. Wolfgang, I fully agree. We have to change our way of thinking, especially if you look at what happened with the NGOs. Development cooperation was also connected to a military presence. So in many provinces where there was no military, there was no development cooperation, no development aid. And especially in the south, especially where the Taliban were active later on. So we need a new way of thinking, especially if you think what happened in Kabul, all the NGOs and the expats living in Kabul. Think about their life. It was not only the case in Kabul, there is this expat life everywhere around the world. We called it the Kabul bubble. They have parties. I don't want to use the term orgy, but excessive parties. There was this real discrepancy between themselves and Afghan society. And this rift got deeper and deeper the more times passed and the security situation declined. So there were no contacts between development aid and people who worked in development aid and the population for whom they should have worked. So that's very important for me to give a statement about that. Wolfgang, would you like to state something? Yes, it is a dilemma. Development cooperation only works if there is safety. That's everybody who says in Afghanistan. Safety is important. It's a priority. If you can't leave your house, no matter whether you're a man or a woman, and if you're scared of being kidnapped, an NGO project can't help you anymore. That's very bad about this whole situation. It was not the case everywhere. In central Afghanistan, where we had no military, no foreign military, and no Taliban either, there was nothing either. So they were completely cut off. Yes, there were some areas, lots of areas where people were cut off from aid. Hazarat, for instance, the Hazaras, again, who administered everything among themselves, who profited a lot from the last 20 years, really. hardly any Pashtun Taliban, hardly any groups in society who resisted. So Bamyan, for instance, that was very quickly conquered by the Taliban, but 80% of the country, we must say the situation was different and the insecurity was different, was very extreme level of insecurity. So what can you do with a project? How can you control a project? That was our problem of GIZ. They would have loved more control, but they were scared. They were scared of having employees kidnapped or maybe murdered. So it is difficult work. The work was very difficult. So this brings us to the dilemma. Only 5 minutes to go. And I would kindly ask you to give us an outlook, because you both mentioned it in your criticism. We talked about the development cooperation. A lot of things have to change. You both are here as our guests today. You have your personal background. You're from Afghanistan. You work for Deutsche Welle in the Afghanistan office. You've visited Afghanistan many, many times. Did politicians or NGOs ever ask, the two of you, you are people who know the country much better than people who only know the Kabul bubble. And there are similar bubbles in all these countries. Wherever there is development cooperation, there is this type of bubble. So did people ask you, what is your contribution? What can you do from your experiences made in different areas? No one asked me, but in general, women or men with enough background from Afghanistan are not asked as experts because they think they are prejudiced, they have the background. I think everyone is biased when it comes to the topic of Afghanistan. How about you, Wolfgang? No, my impression is rather that many people are scared to talk to a journalist like me who knows Afghanistan. They are scared of talking, scared of going there. What is the reason? What do you think? I don't know. I don't know. And I don't know what happens to people who take decisions, but people are tired of Afghanistan. There is ignorance. They don't know what the real problem is in Germany. There is a certain ignorance. Yes, basically, it is important to say that do not forget Afghanistan. This is also a quotation from my book, from the cover of my book. Do not forget Afghanistan. First of all, there is the moral responsibility for Afghanistan, also due to what happened over the last 20 years. We cannot leave people to their own devices, leave them to the terrorists, or leave the country to its own devices. And if this is not enough, you should think about what will happen, because now already, I don't know all the figures, I cannot confirm all the figures. More than 1 million people have left the country since the Taliban took over. So it'll be more and more people will try to leave the country. And at the same time, we see that terrorist groups, the IS, now playing the role, taking over the role of Taliban, Islamic State, and terrorist activities are getting more and more numerous. And of course, this terror won't stay within Afghanistan. They will knock at our door. So what you are asking for, do not forget Afghanistan. And also think about it before we do something else. I think we are running out of time. We are running out of time. Thank you for being here. So interesting to have you here. Thank you for this great moderation. You've been a great moderator. I can only recommend the books. You can see the titles. The Lionesses of Afghanistan, Waslat, Hasrat-Nazimi, Rowold, Wolfgang, Bauer, At the End of the Road, Surkamp Publishers. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for being with us. I hope you enjoyed. and
weiterführen.
maybe
Auch zu dem Thema,
see you
egal,
again
was
next year.
ansonsten auf der Welt passieren wird.
So we hope to
Sehr
talk
schön,
to you
dass-
again, and we will see what will happen in the world, around the world. Thank you for being with us. Thank you.